Hey, my name is James, and in today's video I'm going to show you how I made this Houndstooth Dovetail using just hand tools. Come check it out. Like any joint, this one begins with marking out. I'm going to take the thickness of the pin board and use that to mark the depth of the tails. Then I'm going to put that in the vise and mark lines across, showing exactly where those tails are going to be. This is usually as far as I would go, but here I'm actually going to mark out the line specifically just to show where the tails are going to be. This is just going to help me later on when I come to actually mark out these half pins inside. And just a small tip here, make sure that when you're marking out you have a chisel that's actually small enough to fit inside any of the lines that you're making. This will just help you out a lot further on. I'm going to center these two half pins in the middle of each of the tails that are already there. Once again, I'm just going to square those across the top and then draw in specifically where they're going to go. And here I am just actually coloring with a pencil and showing exactly what material is going to need to be removed. To begin to remove the material, I'm going to start sawing towards the different depth lines, just keeping in mind that some of the depth lines are much shorter than others, so really important to pay attention to make sure you don't go all the way through when you're not supposed to, and just repeating the same process until I've cut all these lines. Once I've done the one side, I'll just flip it over and quickly rip through the other as well. As always, removing the material on the sides is a little bit easier because you just have to saw down to the line and pop the material out. When we get to the center pieces, it'll be a bit more difficult, but we'll find some ways to make that go pretty quick. Because there was a lot of small sections of material to remove, I ended up using a coping saw to do that. Seemed to be the most efficient. Got as much as I could out with the saw itself and then brought it to the bench and just got the rest out with a nice chisel and mallet. Just taking small bites with the chisel until everything was down to that line. Now it was a matter of removing the material from the smaller pins. Originally I had thought about taking a chisel in here right away, but there was just not very much space, so this seemed to be the only way I could do it. Again, just getting out the bulk of the material and then taking it again to the bench and chiseling the rest of the way down to the line. This is one of those places where I'm really glad I checked the size of my chisels before marking out because it was just a tight fit. If I would have gone any smaller, I would have had to redo things because I wouldn't have had a chisel that would have worked. Here I'm just cleaning up everything inside, and basically at this point the tails are done and it's ready to move on towards the pin board. And so here I am marking out the pin board. Couple of the differences is I'm going to mark the same depth line, but as you saw previously, I marked a couple shallower lines where those half pins are going to sit, and this will all make sense in just a second. Here I am placing one on top of the other and just marking the tails onto the pin board. And then once I take those off, I'm just going to make sure I really clearly define what material needs to be kept and what needs to be removed. And to do this, once again, I'm just going to draw in the areas that I want to remove. Because this was my first time doing a houndstooth joint, I just wanted to make especially clear what areas were staying, which were going, so I ended up drawing something like this, connecting the lines down to the depth line, and then beginning to saw out the material. This part of the process was fairly straightforward. Basically, anywhere I could saw a line straight across the piece of wood, that's what I did. And so you can see I started with the larger lines, but then I actually came back and sawed those little half pins as well. Now, depending on how you've laid out your tails and pins, this might not be possible to get as many straight cuts through, but I'm just taking advantage of how it worked out for me. Well, in this scenario, all the dark material is what I want to keep, and so I'm going to start removing all the other material, starting with the large chunks that I know everything needs to come out, and then I'm going to worry about the parts where I'm only going to take out half of it afterwards. Here I am once again using a coping saw and just getting as much of the material out as I can. And then once I've gotten all the material out that I can in this pass, I'm going to take it back to the bench and use a mallet and chisel to just work down to those lines. I condense this for time, but actually in each of these spaces I'm working towards the line slowly, taking small chunks at a time before moving on to the next space. But here I'm just kind of demonstrating what needs to be done in terms of material being removed. But again, just remembering that this is going quicker than it actually took because I wanted to work slowly towards that line so as not to move it. And then once that was done on the bench, I took it back up to the vise just to clear out any of the material that might be hanging out in the bottom, making sure to work from both ways to avoid breaking at any of the pieces. And once that was done, it was just a matter of figuring out how to remove the small bit of material that remained, just that little white part at the bottom there. And the best thing I could come up with was actually to pair towards the line, define that line further with the chisel and the mallet, and then actually just come from the edge and pop out material in the similar way I would do if I was making a half-blind dovetail. And this method seemed to work just well to get down to the depth I needed. I would say this method worked particularly well because the grain was fairly straight in this piece. Just be aware that if the grain is running in different directions, you might run into some issues just chipping out material like this. But overall it worked fairly well. I was able to get the bulk of the material out this way before taking it back to the vise just to clean up anything that remained. At this point, in theory, the joint should be able to come together. But with a lot of dovetails, especially when you're first starting out cutting them, you're going to find that you need to make a lot of micro adjustments. And so I found that the more you are able to test and the more you're able to kind of individually work at the different places, the easier it's going to come together. And so here's just a bunch of shots of me cleaning up the dovetail a little bit, testing to see if it's going to fit, and then interchanging between those two activities until finally the dovetail comes together. And here, patience is really the name of the game. It's going to be very tempting to remove more material than you need to. There might be some foreshadowing in that statement as you try to get the dovetail to fit together. But here, finally, after a bunch of work, it finally fit together, and I was able to get the joint completely seated. And now it's just a matter of gluing it up. Like always, just getting glue in all the little spaces, all the faces that basically are going to be connected, getting some glue in there. There'll be a bit of squeeze out, and I often take some plain shavings just to wipe that away and see what we come up with. When I was actually trying to fit this together, there was a few places where I couldn't quite tell where the joint was tight. I knew it wasn't fitting together the way I wanted it to, but I couldn't quite tell exactly where. And it ended up with me actually removing places that I shouldn't have removed and ending up with gaps. And so the lesson I learned here is just to go a bit more slowly and make sure that when you're taking material away, you're taking it away for a reason. Just because the dovetail is tight does not mean you need to remove material on every pin or every tail, but just trying to find those specific places where it's catching and removing what you need to remove. Even with these imperfections, we're still going to try to make these look nice, so I'm going to plane these up. Oftentimes when you do this, the end grain will actually split into the gaps, closing them up a little bit. And then anything I've missed after that or any gaps still showing, I'll fill up with some glue, some fine sawdust, just spread that around. And once that's dried and you've planed it all off again, you shouldn't really be able to tell that there's been a mistake made unless you're looking for it. I'm just going to spread some butcher block oil on this to really make the joint pop. And once we've kind of wiped that all in, we're pretty much going to be calling this one done. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. There's some more on the channel if you want to check those out. Until next time, take care.